1 Intro. Before we go on, make sure to subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast for more untold stories that stay with you long after they end. Here's the truth no one was ready for. He found her letter 3 days after she disappeared from his life. One line inside shattered him. "I wish I had been brave enough to tell you sooner." And from that moment, nothing in his world felt the same. To the day she wrote the letter. She didn't plan to write it that day. It just happened, slowly, quietly, the way most truths finally surface. Evelyn sat at her small wooden desk, fingers tracing the grain as if searching for courage hidden inside the wood. Outside, the world moved normally, but inside her apartment, everything felt painfully still. She picked up the pen, hesitated, put it down, then finally breathed in, deep, shaky, almost frightened of her own honesty. The words didn't come out beautifully. They came out raw, broken, real. "I'm not pulling away because I stopped loving you," she wrote. "I'm pulling away because I'm terrified you'll realize you deserve someone braver than me." Every sentence felt like peeling back a layer she'd kept hidden for years. She wrote about the nights she stayed awake rehearsing conversations she never found the strength to start. She wrote about the fear that lived behind her quiet smile. She wrote about him, how he made her feel safe and yet so vulnerable at the same time. When she finished, Evelyn folded the letter with trembling hands. She held it to her chest for a moment, as if her heartbeat could seal the truth inside. Then she whispered to herself, "Tomorrow, I'll give it to him tomorrow." But deep down, she already knew tomorrow was a promise she didn't trust herself to keep.
Tomorrow.
3 What he saw but never understood. Caleb had always been good at noticing the small things, how Evelyn twisted the sleeve of her sweater when she was anxious, how her laughter softened whenever she was tired. But lately, something changed. Her smile still appeared, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She'd look at him, then look away too quickly, as if afraid he might see the storm gathering behind her calm face. He tried to read her, but her silence made him second-guess everything. When she held his hand, her fingers felt just a little colder. When he asked if she was okay, she'd nod too fast, giving that practiced half-smile he always wanted to believe. He noticed the late-night messages she typed but never sent. He noticed how she lingered at the doorway before leaving, like someone fighting an invisible weight. But he translated every sign into the same fear he'd carried for years. "She's drifting away because I'm not enough." What he didn't understand was that Evelyn wasn't leaving, she was breaking under the pressure of wanting to stay. He mistook her trembling voice for distance, her quietness for disinterest, her hesitation for fading love. If he had known the truth, that she was terrified of losing him, not tired of loving him, he would have held her closer instead of stepping back. But at the time, every signal she sent felt like a door slowly closing. And he had no idea she was on the other side, desperately trying to keep it open. For the night everything broke. It happened on a night that should have been ordinary, quiet, uneventful, the kind you forget by morning. But sometimes it's the small nights that break the loudest. Caleb came home late, exhausted, carrying the weight of a long day. Evelyn was sitting on the couch, knees drawn up, staring at her phone. She looked up when he walked in, offering a small smile that flickered like a candle in wind. He asked, "Everything okay?" She nodded, too quickly, too softly. The lie hovered between them like smoke. Then he noticed the unsent message glowing faintly on her screen. Her thumb darted to hide it, but it was too late. The room tightened. Caleb didn't ask out of anger, he asked out of fear. "Who were you writing?" Evelyn froze, her breath caught. She wasn't hiding a person, she was hiding the truth she couldn't say out loud. But silence can look just like guilt, especially to a man who has been left before. Caleb stood a little straighter, the instinct to protect himself kicking in. If something's wrong, you can just tell me. But she couldn't. Not without that letter she still hadn't delivered. Her voice cracked. It's nothing. And that was the final spark. He misunderstood her trembling for disinterest. She mistook his tension for judgment. Two people who loved each other deeply, suddenly speaking in defenses. Not truths. Caleb grabbed his jacket, not to leave her. Just to breathe. To clear his head before saying something he'd regret. I'll be back, he said. But Evelyn didn't hear, I'll be back. She heard every person who ever walked away from her. Every fear she had written about in that letter. Every whisper of, you're not enough, resurfacing all at once. Before he reached the door, she whispered, okay, barely audible, and that tiny word broke something fragile between them. He walked out into the night. She stayed in the quiet. And neither of them realized they weren't breaking apart, they were breaking for each other. 5. The letter he never received. The apartment felt different that night, quieter. Heavier. As if every object in the room knew something had shifted. Evelyn sat at her desk again. The same place where her first letter began. But this time, her hands didn't tremble from fear. They trembled from the ache of almost losing him. She unfolded the old draft, stared at the crossed-out sentences, then reached for a fresh sheet of paper. The truth poured out faster than she could filter it. I'm scared of how much I love you. I push you away because I don't know how to ask you to stay. You are the only place I've ever felt safe. Her handwriting wavered, ink pooling where her tears touched the page. She wrote about the night he walked out, how she wanted to run after him. How her legs wouldn't move. How the silence felt like punishment for every fear she kept buried. She wrote about wanting to be better, to be braver, to stop choosing silence over honesty. When she finished, she pressed the folded letter to her lips, whispering the words she couldn't say out loud. Please don't give up on me. She placed it carefully in her bag, promising herself she would give it to him in the morning. No more delays. No more hiding behind what-ifs. Tomorrow would be the day she finally fought for something instead of running from it. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. Her phone buzzed, family emergency. A rushed voice. A hospital. A plea for her to come immediately. In less than 5 minutes, she was out the door. The letter still in her bag. Her heart racing too fast to think about anything except getting there in time.
My dearest.
For the next 2 days, she was consumed. No sleep. No phone. No space to breathe. Caleb called, then called again, then stopped. Every missed call deepened his fear that she had chosen to disappear. What he never knew was that the letter, the words that could have saved them both, was sitting inches away from her the entire time. But destiny doesn't wait for explanations. And the letter that held everything never reached the person it was meant to save. 6. The discovery. Caleb didn't plan to enter her apartment that day. He stood at the door for almost a full minute, holding the small box of things she'd left at his place, her forgotten scarf. A book she never finished. A mug with a chipped handle she claimed had character. Returning them felt like closing a chapter he never wanted to end. When he finally stepped inside, the air felt untouched, as if time had paused the moment she walked out. Her sweater draped over the chair, a half-burned candle on the table, silence everywhere, thick enough to press against his chest. He placed the box on her desk, and that's when he saw it. A drawer slightly open, like someone had left in a hurry. Inside, a neatly folded letter with his name written in her handwriting, soft, slanted, unmistakable. For a moment, he simply stared. The room felt too small, the air too thin. His fingers hovered above the paper, afraid that touching it would make it real. When he finally picked it up, he felt the weight of every unsaid word pressed between the folds. He unfolded it slowly. The first line shattered him. I love you more than I know how to say. His breath broke. His hands trembled. Each sentence felt like a confession she had been choking on for months.
If I had known.
She wrote about fear, about losing him, about wanting to be braver for the sake of what they had. She wrote about the night he left, and how she wanted to run after him but couldn't move. Caleb pressed the letter to his chest, eyes burning, jaw clenched with the ache of understanding everything too late. She hadn't disappeared because she was done with him. She had been fighting something he never saw, and he had walked away thinking she didn't care. A soft, broken whisper escaped him. "Evelyn, why didn't you tell me?" But the letter stayed silent in his hands, holding all the truths she never managed to speak. And all the love he never realized was still his. 7. What he would have done if he had known. Caleb sat on the edge of her bed, the letter still warm in his hands. And his mind replayed everything he would have done differently, every moment he now wished he could rewrite. He imagined walking back into that room the night he left, pulling her into his arms before fear twisted their words. He would have told her that love doesn't need perfect sentences to survive. Only honesty. He would have stayed, listened, held her tighter when her voice shook. He would have chosen patience over pride, presence over silence, and the hardest truth of all was this. If he had known what lived in her heart, he never would have walked away. 8. Closing message. If this story stayed with you, even for a moment, let it remind you of one thing. Love breaks not from the things we say, but from the things we're too afraid to speak. Somewhere out there, someone might be waiting for the words you keep hiding. Don't wait for someday. Say them now. And before you go, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. Your support helps these untold stories find the people who need them most.